A quick search resulted in finding a white, plastic box emblazoned with a red cross. Jay swiped it up and brought it back to the unfinished chem lab area. Kate followed him, her face a mask of concern. He handed it to Kate and she put it on the floor. She pressed her thumbs on the latches and the kit opened. An EpiPen, bandages, a tourniquet, and several packages of meds stared back. Kate sifted through the tough paper packs until she found what she was looking for. "There we go," she said. She tore open the paper and shook out 2 caplets. "We don't have any water," she said as she offered the meds to her daughter. "So do your best. I know how much you hate pills." Maeve groaned and then picked the caplets out of her mother's hand. She popped them into her mouth. Her face set in a rigid grimace and then swallowed. She choked once and then exhaled. "Should take the edge off the pain," Jay said. He smiled at the girl, but he was still shaking inside. What good were meds if that thing came down here? They had to find a way out. They had to find some part of the building the CDC or FEMA or the goddamned military didn't know about. Regardless of what awaited them outside, there was no way it could be worse than what they were trapped with. If they could just... "Jay?" Kate's voice cut through his river of thoughts. "I'm sorry," he said. "What did you say?" She gestured to the tripods. "These are all we have. If they get damaged, we're screwed." Jay nodded. "Also means we don't have a way to drive it off. Can only stay in the circle of light." "I've been thinking about that," she said. "Remember what happened during the distillation test?" Jay shuddered at the thought. It turned solid, and all the life went out of it. Right. The distillation test is performed in a vacuum. So if there was no air, there was no way for it to burn. Jay nodded. "Okay, so you think it's flammable?" "Why not?" She glanced toward the shadows outside the semicircle of light. "It shares some properties with regular hydrocarbons, and Sigler's tests aboard Liger showed a very low boiling point. Maybe a flame will destroy it, catch it on fire." Jay thought for a moment. What she said made sense. If only they had a way to test it. He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. We don't even have a goddamned lighter." Kate rolled her eyes. "We're chemists, Jay, and humans have enjoyed the privilege of fire long before they figured out how to write. I think we can manage." He stood and looked out into the shadows as Kate had. The afterimage of the strong lights made his night vision non-existent. He clucked his tongue and walked beyond the circle. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, and the entire time, he kept imagining a long tentacle sliding across the floor toward his feet. He shook away the image, but couldn't stop the shaking in his bones. The afterimage finally faded. In the shadows and dim light cast by the glare of the halogens, he made out sawhorses and tools. They had electricity. They could create a short circuit, true, maybe some sparks. But what the hell could they set on fire with that? He suddenly wished Chuckles was down here with them. He might know how to overload the panels. Shit, he'd have a lighter. Then Jay frowned. "Kate?" "Yeah?" she said from behind him. "We can create a short circuit, maybe, but that might take out the lights entirely." He slowly turned and blinked at her. "And then we'd have nothing." Kate opened her mouth and then closed it. She nodded. "You're right. That's a bad plan." He turned back to the room. There had to be something they could do, some way to defend themselves. Something in the ceiling creaked. Jay looked upwards. Nothing moved. The vents and ducts were still, and nothing black was hanging up there. At least not yet. A concrete saw sat against one of the walls. Drills and pneumatic hammers lay on the sawhorses. A metal stand held a jigsaw. The blade was sheathed in protective rubber. Jay continued walking forward. Something blocky lay at the bottom of the far wall. He pulled out his cell phone and turned on the flashlight mode. He scanned the shadows. If it was down here, he was already dead. He was too far from the circle of light. He knew it, but the light made him feel a little better. Several rectangular shapes jutted from the box. He walked closer, and then a grin slowly spread across his face. When he was close enough for the cell phone to illuminate the shape, he chuckled. "What is it?" Kate called from across the room. Her voice bounced off the concrete walls, words barely discernible in the impossibly long echo. Jay looked down. LED lights, all green. He pulled on one of the rectangular shapes. It clicked out of its slot. Heavy, he thought. He examined it beneath the light and started to laugh. I got it, he said. What? Kate sounded concerned. Jay turned to her and then found himself sprinting across the filthy, debris-covered floor. When he reached the circle of light, he was out of breath but damned near hysterical with laughter. A battery, he panted. A goddamn power tool battery. She blinked. So? He wanted to yell at her in frustration, but instead his grin widened. We can make this thing into a lighter. Sort of. How? She asked. You going to overload it or something? He showed her the exposed contacts. See those? We just need to connect some metal to them. It'll throw off sparks. If we have something pretty flammable, we can create a little fire. She shook her head, a smile appearing on her face. Where the hell did you get that idea? He laughed. Boy Scouts. We used steel wool for fire starter when it was too wet to catch kindling. The stuff burns pretty well. Got it from SOS pads. Oh, man, Kate said. We don't have any steel wool. He shook his head. No, we don't. But what we have is a room full of dust, wood chips, and, he said, pointing at his shirt, threaded fabric. We cut the thin t-shirts into strips, unwind the threads as best we can, and then, he licked his lips, we pray. And what are we going to use for metal? Jay frowned. We could try folding some aluminum or something like that. He turned back and looked around the floor. Someone has to drink soda down here. Kate looked lost in thought. Jay knew how she felt. Materials. They had plenty to start a fire, but what the hell were they going to use to create the circuit? She glanced over at her daughter and then smiled. I've got it, she said. The suits. They have metal woven into them. Jay smacked his forehead. That will work. Metal threads. Okay, we have a plan, so let's get moving on it. Their shared smile disappeared as the ceiling creaked. Something banged in the ducts. They traded stares, and then they started working. It didn't take long to come up with a plan. The only difficult part would be making it out alive. Neil didn't have high hopes for that. The secure area had Halon systems that would be nearly impossible for them to sabotage. Even if they managed to get on a ladder and smash the sensors, he wasn't sure that would keep them from going off. Hell, the system might read their tamper attempts as an actual incident and gas them all to death. Of course, suffocating can't be any worse than being eaten alive, Neil thought. He shivered. The whole situation was ludicrous. If he hadn't seen the M2 firsthand, he'd never believe such a thing was possible. An organism that acted like a hydrocarbon, but was capable of absorbing damn near anything as food and changing form? Not possible. Something that could hide its atomic form from an electron microscope? Again, impossible. No one would believe it. If he pinched himself enough times, maybe he'd wake up. You are awake, he told himself. You just wish this was a nightmare. He, Mike, and Bill had brainstormed how to accomplish their task. Hoyt was still lost in her own little world and only answered if they called her by her first name. Neil didn't think she was ever going to snap out of it. In a way, she had it easy. At least she had already accepted they were going to die. Neil still had hope. For the most part, Mike had only nodded while he and Bill came up with the plan, but Mike definitely understood what they were going for. Even better, he approved. And that was the kind of leader he'd been for Hal. He hired good people, let them figure out the problems, and gave them whatever resources they needed to succeed. In this case, they had all the resources they could want. The trouble was execution. Sabotaging the Halon systems came first. The Halon tank was located in the secure area and surrounded by a metal shield. Getting past it required a pair of bolt cutters and some elbow grease. The real trick was disconnecting it, and, of course, bleeding the entire system. Bill was still in his chair at the front of the lab. The old scientist was clearly spent. If they had to move fast, he was going to be more of a hindrance than Hoyt. When you pulled on her, at least her legs worked. Bill, though, had torn something. He wasn't going anywhere fast, and he was too big for either Mike or Neil to carry. If things went to shit, Neil planned on just pushing him through the hall in his goddamn chair. He hoped like hell it didn't come to that. Every time he imagined doing it, a laugh tried to crawl out of his throat. If it did come to that, He doubted he'd be laughing at all. Mike stood next to the metal shield, a large pair of bolt cutters in his hands. He faced the barrel at the other end of the room. The barrel. The M2 barrel. PPE's very own plague. Neil was closer to it, eyes focused on the orange ribs. They seemed to have, ballooned a bit, like something was pushing on them from inside. The image of tentacles bursting through the top and eating him flashed through his mind. He shook it away. "You okay?" Mike asked. Neil nodded. "Yeah, just don't like being close to that shit." "I know the feeling." Mike tested the handles of the cutters. They moved easily. The suicidally sharp, serrated teeth slid by one another as he closed it tight. "Yep, this will do just fine." "So we cut the lock, and then we cut the pipe." Mike nodded. "And then we pray a lot." Neil pulled a mask from his belt. He'd managed to salvage 2 of the filtration masks from the storage cabinet. There were no more of them in Biolab. ChemLab might have them, but he wasn't going in there. Standing this close to the barrel was bad enough. Being directly below the opening the M2 had used to escape? Fuck that. "Put this on," he said, and handed a mask to Mike. Mike looked at it and pursed his lips. "This is going to mess up my hair, isn't it?" Neil laughed despite himself. "Yeah, although I have news for you, it's already pretty messed up." Mike smiled. "So this stuff is toxic?" Neil shrugged. "Depends on what kind of howling and what kind of exposure. If you bleed it wrong, it could kill us on the spot for all I know." "Great," Mike said. "No pressure?" "None at all." Neil pulled on his mask and fought with the uncomfortable plastic straps. It pinched his skin and he gritted his teeth. He breathed through his nose. The air tasted like rubber. He wrinkled his nostrils. "Yeah," Mike grinned. "That looked pleasant." "Straps are the least of the problem." Neil's voice was muffled by the mask. "Wait till you smell it." Mike laughed as he pulled on the mask. It was awkward because he was still holding the bolt cutters, but he managed just the same. The boss was nothing if not dexterous. He shook his head. "Feel like I'm breathing through a condom." Neil nodded. He knew Mike couldn't see his expression, but he was grinning just the same. "Well, let's see if we can screw this up. You watch that barrel." "I will," Neil said. He turned so he could keep an eye on it. He heard the sounds of Mike grunting and metal clinking. After a few seconds, the room echoed with the solid snap of metal breaking. He winced at the sound. The barrel didn't move. He didn't think M2 was capable of hearing anyway. Otherwise, the creature would have found them long before this. Bill posited that maybe it was sensitive to sound waves as well as light waves. Neil didn't think he was right about sound. But light? That made more sense. How else could it see without actual eyes? Or were those stalks with the orbs really some kind of visual mechanism he didn't understand? If the goddamn thing wasn't so dangerous, he'd love to actually examine a sample of its appendages. But that was impossible. The real question, however, was whether or not the people outside, those federal people, thought it was too dangerous to study. Based on what the voice had said on the radio, they wanted it for that reason. They couldn't have it. If they still thought they could control it after battling the M2 at Ben Taub, their judgment was obviously in question. You'd have to be a complete moron to... The metal shield creaked and groaned as Mike pushed it open. Neil's thought train derailed at the sound. He held his breath as Mike walked inside the shielding. Through the gap in the shield, the huge brushed metal tank looked as though it hadn't been serviced in a very long time. A cloud of dust rose into the air. He couldn't see what Mike was doing, but he was definitely wiping at something. "Can't even see the damned gauges," Mike's muffled voice said. "Remind me to get this thing serviced." "Considering you're about to destroy it, that might be a good idea." "Smart ass," Mike said. His voice, filled with tension, had a trace of humor just the same. "I'm wiping these gauges so I could see the readings, but I have no idea what I'm looking at." Neil shook his head. "Once you cut the feed line, it's not going to matter. Just stay the hell away from the pressurized gas. It's going to jet out at pretty high pressure. Might even cut a finger off." "Great," Mike said. Neil turned back to the barrel. He blinked. The lowest rib looked like it had bulged a little more. And then he heard it. A pinging noise. Something was hitting the barrel from the inside. Didn't take a PhD to know what that was. Hurry, Mike, we may not have much time. What? I don't have time for a pee break? Neil shook his head. The rib pulsed. I think whatever's in the barrel wants to get out. Fuck. More clanging from inside the shield. Okay, I think I've got the feed line. The barrel trembled. Cut it, now! His ears rang from the sound of his own voice. A sudden rush of air filled the room. Mike jumped backwards out of the shielded area. A blast of whitish gas rose to the ceiling with a roar. He couldn't hear anything over the sound. Mike stumbled into him, and Neil reached to steady the CEO. The bolt cutters fell to the floor and bounced. Then his skin began tingling. The tingling started to burn. Neil put his hands on Mike's shoulders and led him through the secure door and back into the biolab. As soon as he closed the door, the sound of the pressurized gas escaping the tank disappeared, but the ringing in his ears was nearly as bad. Mike stumbled forward and leaned against one of the lab tables. His shirt was ripped at the left cuff and his skin was red and raw. The parts of his face not covered by the mask and straps were blistered. You okay? Neil asked. Mike reached up and pulled off the mask. A long, thin swath of skin peeled off the side of his head where one of the straps had been. A drop of crimson beaded out of the wound but didn't flow down. Yeah, just fucking dandy. He spat a wad of phlegm to the floor. Neil pulled off his mask. He hadn't gotten the full dose of the nitrogen-halon mixture, but that didn't mean his skin wasn't itching like mad. He pointed to the sink. Wash your skin. Try and get that shit off of it. Mike said nothing as he headed to the emergency sink. He placed his face in front of the large shower head and pushed. Water welled out and sprayed against his skin. He gave a short-lived scream and then simply shook beneath the water. When he ceased the flow, he turned around and looked at Neil. Well, that was bracing. Cold? Mike shook his head. Not until you get that shit off you. Then it's freezing. Neil stepped past him and followed the same procedure. Mike hadn't been kidding. The water seemed warm for the first few seconds, and then it was icy cold. He fought through the discomfort until he bathed his face, arms, and neck. When he stepped away, he was freezing. Brisk, he said through chattering teeth. Mike leaned against one of the tables. The man was in fantastic shape, but he looked as though he'd just run a marathon through hell. That was step one, right? Neil nodded. Yeah, but I think we have another problem. Mike rolled his eyes. Now what? He pointed toward the secure room. The barrel. It's moving inside the barrel. I think it's trying to break out. Bill giggled, and then he belly laughed. The hell is your problem? Mike asked. Bill held his head in his hands as he laughed. The sound in his throat abruptly died, and he looked up. His lips were set in a stony grin. It can't. He searched for a word, didn't find it, and shook his head. Dissolve? Dissemble? Absorb? Hell, I don't know what it does. But it can't do that to metal, right? From what we've seen, that's correct, Neil agreed. But it can grow solid appendages. Sharp ones at that. I'll bet that's what it's banging against the inner metal. Yeah? Mike asked. So? Simple physics, Bill said. How could it possibly do much damage unless it could get leverage? It would have to be pressing against at least 2 points of the barrel to make it bulge. Neil blinked. The rib had been pushed out on one side, not all the way around, but he hadn't checked the side facing the wall, and he sure as shit wasn't going to walk close enough to check. So what do you think, Bill? Maybe it's more corrosive to metal than we think. Maybe it needs time to weaken it. Bill pointed to the chem lab and the pipes leading to the dispensing station. Those pipes are thick, but not as thick as that barrel. If it's doing damage to the barrel, what's to say the stuff trapped in the pipes isn't doing the same? Neil bit his lip. He tried to imagine what the M2 was doing in the pipes. Once the vacuum pump was connected to the barrel, its contents rushed into the pipes and whatever didn't fit there remained in the barrel. So was it one contiguous organism? Just spread out over the 10 meters of piping and the barrel itself? Oh, shit. Neil scratched at his arms. That's bad. Okay, Mike said. Maybe I'm stupid, but I don't get it. We're gonna burn the goddamn stuff anyway. Bill nodded. And the sooner the better.